Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another year of TEL Researchers and HE Researchers series. 2026 is our fifth year running this project initiative. So thank you for your support. So joining us today is Professor Damien Page, Vice-Chancellor from Buckinghamshire University, also known as Puyin's boss. So nice words for me, please, everyone. And of course, joining me as well is my co-host, John Brindle. John, do you want to introduce yourself before we start?
Yeah, hello. My name is John Brindle. I am a Learning Design Manager at Edge Hill University, also a PhD student at Lancaster University on the TEL and e-research programme.
Yeah, John's technically my classmate, although you don't really have classmates on the PhD program, but this is where we met, and we've been really good friends ever since. Right, so the format today is a conversation between Damien, myself, and John. We've got some questions prepared to ask Damien about his scholarly story. But of course, as always, you're very welcome to contribute comments, questions in the chat. There will be opportunities towards the end of the conversation where you can come to the mic, or if you have any burning desire to ask any question any point in the next sort of 15 minutes or so, please just put your hand up and we'll come to you. All right then, so I'm going to kick off with the first question, which is probably a very obvious question. So Damien, how did you get into education? More precisely, perhaps, how did you get into prison education? Because that really fascinates me.
Yeah, I grew up in a traditional working class family, first generation, first going to the family, first to stay on pass at school at 16, to be honest. So education was kind of this, it was just like this blank space. I didn't know what to expect after 16. I didn't know anyone who'd stayed on to do A-levels, didn't really know what an A-level was. But I passed the 11 plus because I had a selective system down in Kent where I grew up. And the grammar school was, well, just go to university. That was just the route. Didn't know anything about university, but I literally went because I didn't want to work. You know, I saw what the options were of working. Most of my friends were, my family were labourers. It's not something that appealed to me. I was too lazy for that. So I went and did English and American literature. The only thing I liked in school was literature. Which, there's kind of an outsiderness where I grew up. I'd have to hide the books I was reading if my cousins came around, for example. I'd have been beaten up, in a jovial, friendly, familial way. But it was that kind of, it just wasn't the done thing. I went to university, didn't make the most of the experience. I mean, I was a commuter student before the term was even invented. I had to work part-time with loading lorries throughout university, just even though I didn't have fees, that was just to get me through, pay the bills. Came out, worked in advertising, worked in recruitment for a while, didn't like either of those. So I got a good bonus one year, went to Southeast Asia and just travelled around for 6 months till the money ran out. And it was there. And this is how I remember it. My memory might be a bit hazy. I was on it was after a full moon party in Thailand. If any of you have been at Koh Phangan full moon parties, you know the kind of territory. And I knew I had to do something that had meaning. I couldn't go back and continue the way that the work I'd been doing that just held no meaning, no motivation. And for me, it was teaching. Now I didn't want to do primary school. I couldn't do that. My hat's off to primary school teachers. 30 youngsters. No, I couldn't do that. Secondary didn't look much more appealing. But I came back and I've been home about a week, trying to acclimatise again. I saw an advert for post-16 teacher training. It was a new course at Christchurch, Canterbury Christchurch at the time. It was the first year it was going to run. And the advert just said, teaching colleges. And I didn't really know much about colleges, but it said teaching prisons as well. Fantastic. Let's do some of that adult education. This appealed to me. So I went to the teacher training and just never looked back. So I went to Lewisham College for 6 years. I mean, it was a tough inner city college, but it was fantastic. The experience there, it was probably the first time I'd experienced any meaning in the work that I'd done. Completely dedicated to, even the 6-week summer holidays, it was spent preparing, it was spent reading just to become a better teacher. There was something that just drove me. And it was the young people we worked with who had been failed by compulsory education, and FE, you know, it's the cliche about the second chance sector, but it really is, you know, particularly at that time. And it was there, you know, I just got a love for education. I saw it's become a cliche on every university marketing now about education's transformative, but there it was. You know, it's not always transformative, but for students like those, for students like we have at BNU, it truly is. So that was that. I went from there into teacher training at Greenwich, and that's where I started. Again, because it's post 16, a lot of it was in service teacher training. So these people are already working in colleges or adult centres or prisons. And I ended up having a lot of students who taught in prisons. And it was probably the most fascinating experiences of my life in education. Just so completely different, you know. So I won't name which prison it was, obviously, but there was a lot of Category A prisons. So the most serious crimes in there. And there was one, I'll give you an example. The best one I always remember, I'll talk about this time blue in the face. It was a music lesson, right? So there was 5 inmates there. I didn't know. It's a weird experience if you're observing it, you know, because you don't know what they've done. You know, it's Category A, so you know it's pretty bad, the crimes they're in. But in that moment, and there's a complete lack of resources. You know, the prison officers often aren't supportive of education. It's a tough environment in many ways to teach it. And it was just this kind of cocoon of education for an hour and a half. You know, the prisoners was there, but they were just learners. And they were learning Bob, I can't remember which Bob Marley song it was, but it was a Bob Marley song. And the teacher was just phenomenal. The calmest person I've ever met, you know, in education. It was he was only a little guy, but it was his arena, you know, and those prisoners, and they were mostly in for life. They just respected him. You could see that. And it was just, you forgot about the security measures that you passed and the fact that what they've done. It was just pure education. It was a joy. And I learned so much from those classes. That's the beauty of working in teacher training, is constant learning. You know, you're in prison one day, then you're observing a carpentry lesson. And in each of those, there's different learning. So that's a really long answer about how I got into it, but hopefully it gives you a flavour.
It does, and I think, you know, obviously I've spoken to Damien a few times over my time at BNU in the last few months. It's your passion for education and really transforming people's lives, students' lives, that's really inspiring. So I'm going to pass it to John for the next question.
So was it a conscious decision then to move from the FE sector into HE and then into research as well?
Yeah.
Was that like a conscious decision? And can you just talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so I started, when I was still in FE, I started a master's with the Open University. And it got to the dissertation. I mean, I didn't particularly enjoy some of it, I've got to admit. It was, but then when it came to the dissertation, when you got that freedom to research, and you know, you start entering research for the first time, and that grabbed me the same way that teaching did. You know, so for me, it became very clear that I wanted to do this for a living. I mean, for many years, I had no interest in leadership. I was offered various leadership jobs, and I politely and not so politely turned them down because I wanted to be a prof. You know, I just imagined when I first went into HE, and I started in Greenwich, and in week 1, I found my 2 supervisors, enrolled, and just got on with it from week 1. The research was what drove me then more than the teaching side. The teaching, you know, it diminished in what I was doing because I was competent, and I liked that. You know, I was a good teacher, but I've been doing it for a few years. Research, I was a novice. And the one thing that's consistent in my career, I love being a novice. I love being amateur. You know, particularly as you get older, and I've been in higher education 19 years, 5 years in FE. You know, I'm experienced in many things, but I still like putting myself in positions where I'm an amateur because there's a thrill to it. You know, you sit in there and you just don't know how to do something, but you have a determination that I'm going to find out and I'm going to get good at this. So research, yeah, started the PhD straight away. And I mean, I'm technically a professor of education, but my research has never been, it's based around education, but it's not about teaching and learning or assessment or anything like that. It's more about organisations within the education sector, organisational behaviours. That's what fascinates me. It did then. Reading a lot of, when I started a doctorate, it was around resistance, resistance to change, resistance to leadership amongst managers. And it kind of, it set me up nicely for the career at the end of that I've gained, because if you're going to go into leadership, you're going to deal with a lot of resistance. But it was it was about organisations. That's what fascinates me. So there is a kind of thread between the research I did and moving into leadership. But research, I just loved it, and it was I like the isolation. A lot. I remember the PhD when I was doing that, and a lot of PhD students experience that loneliness, that kind of disconnection from an environment. I think universities are getting better at that. But when I did mine, it was complete. But I loved it. I loved the fact that I could wake up, and I would get up 6 o'clock in the morning. By 7, I'm researching, desk research, analysing data, and I'll be there till 9 o'clock at night. Bliss. Just bliss. It was uninterrupted. This was before Teams. It was well before the pandemic. So you got the odd email, but you just turn your emails off. There was no contacting me. It was a different time, and it was just bliss. But I didn't have any children at the time. Wasn't married. God, it was fantastic. And I missed it. Do you know what I mean? I missed that the attention span. Because I'll never get it back. It'll take me years to get that attention span where you can sit for that many hours just analysing data, writing, and yeah, I'm getting all nostalgic now, but you get the flavour.
I mean, that sounds ideal. Yeah. I wish, I'm studying part time and trying to do a PhD part time. I'd love to have that ability to focus and just
And you got a kid as well, haven't you? Because Gabby's 14 now, so she was a kid when you started, right? So
I think it's different now, because there wasn't, back then it wasn't the pressure to publish either. It was literally you did your doctorate and you just focused on that. I know, in many universities now there is, you've got to have 3 publications by the time you get to Viva. I mean, it just wasn't like that then. Because I was doing mine, I worked there as well, so I worked full time. It was technically part time, but I tended to spend more time on the research than the other parts of the job. My admin was appalling. I didn't hit any deadlines, and so I got away with it. But it was the research that drove me at that time.
So obviously, you really enjoy research, and it's good to know, because I'm going to be emailing you a lot of questions about research now, and because I do have access to Damien as being my boss, as that's the privilege, right? And so obviously you're now in a senior leadership position, and two questions within this is, do you still carve out time, dedicated me time to do research? And the second part of this question is, what part of your researcher/scholarly identity has been the hardest for you to hold on to? Now you have a university you're responsible for.
I think the last time I actually carved out proper time for research was when I was at Wolverhampton, so as dean. I was able to do it then, not for the first 9 months, because there were a lot of things to fix. So I don't do it now. I've written a chapter this year, and it was the first time I'd done any consistent writing for a while. So I was invited to write a book chapter, and just sitting down, and you know what you want to write about, you're just out of practice. It's like the muscle's gone. They talk about the muscle memory. It's the same with research, I think, and with writing. I think many of us find this. If you get out of the habit, it's really hard to get back in. It's like you get to the end of the PhD and you're like peak performance. And then after that, when I started publishing regularly, and I was publishing 3 academic articles a year, it was the rhythm. I'd be working on one would be under review, one's just about to come out, and you're just churning them out, and that's your peak performance. You get into leadership, it takes it away. Because the demands change, your attention span change. I've got the attention span of a 3-year-old now, honestly, because it's constantly changing. I might have, you make dozens of decisions in a day, big decisions, small decisions. There's always problems working universities or any organisation. So you're distracted a lot. I can be talking about one thing in 1 hour, and then it completely changes. So trying to find dedicated time. I have thinking time, but again, it's not I'd love to get back to research, and I do have a book in mind. I've never wrote a book, never wanted to, because in my mind, and I was about efficiency, I think. So I thought if I wrote a book, I could probably get 3 or 4 articles out instead in that time. What's going to serve my career best? Because I've always been careerist, and if you're into research, unfortunately, you have to think about numbers, and you do have to think about impact factors. You do have to think carefully about which journals you submit it to. I mean, I only ever submitted to quartile. Some people don't believe in journal rankings, right? And there are good arguments on both sides, but it has meaning, whether we like it or not. How journals are ranked, there's the reputation element, which is still there, and I don't care what anyone says about we only judge the output. Whoever's judging articles, whether it's a rep or whatever, there is a reputation for certain journals. So only publishing quartile 1 journals. I think the numbers, if you want to make Prof, you have to do that. There is a game to be played. But I do have a book in mind now. I think it would probably be better after I retire, after I'm not representing an institution anymore. It'll be politically more astute, I think. Let's put it that way. So no, I mean, the short answer, yeah, I don't. I think in periods of change, particularly in the way the sector is at the moment, my time is better spent on the organisation. And you have to make that trade-off. And I knew that if you're going into senior leadership in particular, there is a trade-off. In terms of my identity, I don't know, it's a tough one. There are still patterns of thinking, I think, that never go away from research. If it's similar to leadership in a way. You identify a problem. You've been trained, if you've done a PhD, you've been trained to think in a certain way. You've been trained to follow certain elements of evidence. I was a qualitative researcher. Stats, I'm like a 3-year-old with stats. But qualitative research was what I was interested in. And that's probably those transferable skills, which again, we don't talk enough about, I don't think, in research, are vital for leadership. You can... I can read really quickly and digest things very quickly, and you're looking at regulations and God, how dull that is. So it's just about identifying the key points, but it's following threads. I think with qualitative research, what I always really loved about it, you do something, you got, 100 hours of interviews data, for example. And this is before, I never used NVivo. I was pure cold, whole, traditional, let's code this myself. Because I still believe that you get a better result if you're going to do the coding yourself. As you're reading, you're engaging with someone's story. And then that's what it comes down to. These are narratives. Qualitative research is only about narratives. And with my literature background, that's how I always saw them. These are stories. These are people's lived stories. And so I think it never felt right just to put it through software and say, well, this was mentioned 10 times. It just never felt right. For me, it was about respecting people's stories. And so qualitative data was about that. You see patterns and patterns emerge. And I love that, the grounded theory kind of stuff. There's a beauty in the way that patterns emerge from data. And it's not dissimilar to leading an organisation. There are patterns in an organisation, particularly a complex organisation like universities. So if you are adept at spotting those patterns, solving problems becomes much easier. But you're doing it authentically. It's not. I mean, one of the things I don't like about senior leadership is you kind of get dragged into looking at things by metrics. So you look at certain times of the year, NSS or student outcome data. Conditions of registration metrics, whatever it is. But this is there's a temptation to start just focusing on that. They've gone up 5%. Well, what does it mean? Does that mean 5? How many more students is that? These are students. These are people's lives. And so you follow the narratives, and if you've got to see it in that kind of way, I think. So I still think like a researcher, or I'd like to think I do. The actual outputs have diminished over the years. Let's put it that way.
I think we know what the answer to this question is, but I just have to ask. Knowing what you know now, would you have made the same career choice to go into senior leadership, or would you go, do you know what? I'm going to be a researcher so I can spend 7 to 7 sort of just being in the zone and writing. What would you have done the same, or would you have done something differently? How would you?
I don't know. God, that's a horrible question. It really.
Sorry.
But no, it's great. No, I don't think I'd have changed things. There's a season for everything. I did research like intensively for a long time, and I think genetically I have a short attention span anyway. So after doing that for a few years, and it was always, you get published in the right journals, and you just think, what am I going to do this for the next 20 years? Do you know what I mean? Am I going to do anything new? Am I going to learn anything new? And it started getting a bit rote almost. I knew exactly whichever journal I was thinking about, I knew exactly what would get published. And you start writing this. It just become too formulaic, I think, or the way I did it anyway. There are some, I've always kind of admired or been fascinated by those academics, professors mainly, who only research and write about the same thing for their entire career. And every paper is a variation on that one central theme. And you just think, don't you get bored? I don't honestly know how people can do that for like 20, 25, 30, 40 years, just writing about the same thing. I mean, don't you get to the point where you think, God, I might do something else? I don't know. I did. I was a very eminent professor. I don't think it was a compliment, but he said, you're an itinerant researcher, Damien. You jump around a lot. And if you look at my research, it was because I'd write about 3 articles on something and I'd get bored. The point of research for me was finding new things I didn't know about, and having to keep reinventing myself as an amateur. So my first research papers were about FE leadership. There was about construction lectures and that transition from the building site into the classroom. Did some stuff around teacher misconduct, which again, landed differently because some people didn't like the fact I was talking about it, but it's just part of organisations. Any organisation will have those people who will misbehave. It's just a normal part, but people didn't like the fact I was talking about it, I think. Did some stuff around alternative provision. Did some stuff about how teachers misuse the internet while at work because it interested me. But none of it was funded. It was funded by my organisation, but you wouldn't have got funding for it because it's not there was not the kind of sort of work that got funded. I did it because I was interested. And because I was, employed as a senior lecturer, the head of department, etc. So I was getting paid not to research. I was getting paid to do the leadership of the teaching. So research was a kind of a sideline. But I don't know. I think I got too short an attention span to have done just research for the rest of my life, I think.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good answer, and I think actually this kind of follows on as well. What I was going to kind of ask about is, are there any moments that you think in your career which changed how you understood academic work, and kind of similar to that, how you're thinking about scholarship might have evolved over time? Just some thoughts on that, if that's okay.
Yeah. I think it's been individuals, and I go back to teacher training. I talked about the prison example, but I saw some extraordinary practice when I was doing that. There was another one of my students was teaching in a school for students with severe learning difficulties, and the challenge that she faced and how expertly she did it. And it was kind of. I've seen some amazing teachers. I always thought I was a good teacher, but I've seen some amazing teachers. And that always inspired me. In research terms, it was you just come across a paper. I mean, when you're doing a PhD or you're doing the literature review for whatever you're working on, and you dial in a lot of it in, right? You're going through 50 papers and nothing's really landed, but you just got to show that you've read around, and then you come across one, and it's just from the abstract. You think, bloody hell, this is something. I don't know what it is. There was David Collinson. He did some research. I think it was David Collinson, a long time ago. I'm thinking that there was a paper he'd written about a disaster on an oil rig. Right now, this is what I say. I'm not really an education researcher because it's an oil rig. But he'd been contracted. There was a major disaster. Fatalities, and he was brought in to look at the reasons why. And I was hooked. it was fascinating. It was like a dissection of an organisation, a dissection of organisational lives, misconduct, people turning a blind eye, all of those kind of things that no one seemed to really talk about, particularly in HE, because back then, you're so polite. I mean, God, we've all heard stories of how some academics behave, for example. Look at research fields in labs, we've all heard about those supervisors who are not exactly supportive of their early career research colleagues. But here, for the first time, was someone just being honest about what happened. And you see, it just opened a thread around how individuals resist in organisations, how the different types of resistance. And I don't just mean strike action, I mean, the different types of routine resistance. Then there was a book that led me onto a book by, I can't remember his name, Scott. It was about how Weapons of the Week, it's called. If you're ever interested in it, read Weapons of the Week. So this is about how peasant society resisted feudal overlords, and just fascinating. Things like foot dragging, and you never think about it. You just think, in terms of resistance, but it was those kind of threads. So that hooked me. So it was the odd paper. If I'm going to do research, I've got to be interested. It has to grab me. Same as leadership. I've had a couple of leadership jobs that were so boring. It's so boring because they didn't have the freedom at that point. That was more junior. You couldn't get into what I wanted to get into. We knew what the problems were, but the head of the department, the dean, didn't really want those exposed. So it's got to be something that grabs me. I completely forgot what your question is. Did I answer that? If not, John, Julian, just
you were close, and I think it's that thinking about scholarship. As your thoughts around scholarship and your own kind of scholarly practice, how has that changed kind of over time and evolved for you? And I love the ideas of this, following what you're interested in, those threads being the interesting. That's a really fascinating thing, and I can empathise with the getting bored very quickly. I'm writing my thesis. I think, what year are we on now? I think I'm on year 5, and I'm feeling that already. But about your scholarly identity and things like that, how, in terms of, do you feel like it's got more complex, or have you just followed that interest, or do you feel like you've engaged deeper with things, or you've always got?
Yeah, I think it's become more applied. My scholarly interest and where I do research, it's generally because I've got a problem with work. There is a problem to be faced. It's still about what interests me. So, I've got a fairly long commute. I probably haven't read an education book for about 10 years. Nothing education related. I'm reading one at the moment about how Netflix was started. I read about the hospitality sector, Silicon Valley, those kind of organisational studies that are completely removed from what I understand. And I went to an AI conference in Bologna last year. And so one of the biggest ones in the world, right? And there was something like 500 AI researchers. Now, I use ChatGPT. I understand the principles of AI, but this hardcore researchers, right? So they're straight out of the lab. I felt old. I'm 52 coming up, but I felt like an old man because there was a lot of youngsters here, and they would most of it went over my head. But the beauty of it was getting back to being a novice again, and it was a really good reminder that that's what I enjoy. I'm an experienced leader. There's very few things now that happen that I haven't come across in the past, or read about, certainly. But just making yourself novice, and that's what scholarship is about. I think you stop being a scholar if you stop being novice. Scholarship's all about traditionally becoming an expert. But then what? What do you do when you're an expert? You just be an expert? No, not for me. I have to make myself novice. And often that's, listening to audio books about things I know nothing about. Read a great book about the guy, Bob Iger, who was the CEO of Disney. He retired. He's the one that kind of saved Disney. He retired and he's been brought back. Just fascinating. It's fascinating to see worlds and try and understand worlds that I know nothing about. So I think that curiosity's still there. I think that's probably the main thread that's remained and survived, I guess, into leadership, is that curiosity. So it was there when I started going teaching. I was curious about how to be a better teacher. I was curious about the lives of my students and how I could then engage them in a different way. I was curious about how to be a good leader. The research, constant curiosity, and I still am. If that ever goes, then I'll retire. And it sounds a bit flippant, but if I don't have that curiosity, for me, the job's not worth doing. You need someone else in this job. Particularly, if you're a VC, you've got to be curious. The day you start thinking, I know it all, I've done it, that's when organisations fail. That's where you fail as a VC. So if I lose that curiosity, and I think I've got enough good people around me who will tell me, you're just not curious anymore. That'll be my epitaph, you realise, of course. He just stopped being curious, and that's on the gravestone. I'm sure my daughter gets that on.
I think the one thing I've really been feeling about being a BNU is that, well, first thing, Damien being approachable, because I made a comment before. The last time I spoke to one of my VCs was never. So that's really appreciated across the board. And also, for those of you who don't know, when you email Damien, he always replied. And if you want a meeting, he will find a time, because you've done the back to the floor kind of series where you go to every department to really get to understand what we do, which is very much appreciated. We have a question from Kelly, which is you've had having such a varied career. What are you most proud of? It can be in your research or in your career more generally. What are the most proud moments in your professional journey?
So it's another big question. We'll start with the research. When my first publication, I remember my first rejection, probably even better. The first rejection, that hurts, man. You poured years into your PhD, all those hours alone, and you get your first rejection. And it's the typical reviewer too, I hate you, I hate everything you've done, don't ever write again, that kind of stuff. And they're still, we know they're still out there. So that one hurt. But then that first publication, just nothing like it. It was good becoming doctor. And it's not about the title, it's about the work, but that title has meaning. Being first in family at university, and then being a doctor, and it's kind of that was a weird experience. First time my dad ever hugged me actually was on my graduation as a doctor, so that tells you. I'm not going to get weepy, I'm not that type, but you get the point. There is a meaning, there's a wider meaning beyond it. It does mean something, particularly if you're from a working class background. There are very few. And I mean, through the Working Class Leaders Network, I've met more working class origin academics now and leaders, but it's still not talked about enough. So anyway, there was that first publication. Other than that, I'll go back to the metrics thing, right? Now, I remember the first graduations I went to, and everyone loves graduations, right? Highlight of the academic year. I don't know if it's because I'm a melancholy type or glass half empty. I'm not generally. But for every student that walked across there, I was thinking about the students that didn't. Right? You look at the continuation completion stats or whatever it is. And I've worked in universities where, it was 75% of students completing. You think that's 25 people we've let down. 25% we've let down. And as you move up in an organisation, that starts representing thousands of students. So it's things like that where you just think because of the work I've done, there are now more students crossing that stage and receiving their award. And that's not a metric thing. It plays, of course, it helps in league tables and whatever the people pay attention to, those kind of things. It has those percentages have a type of meaning. But getting more students across that stage, that has meaning. And as a senior leader, it reconnects me, I think, to the purpose of what we're doing. I miss teaching for that kind of the immediacy of it. When you start, I remember you first started teaching, and when you're in a classroom, and you'll all know this, and you see the penny dropped or the light bulb moment with your students, you explain something that's difficult, and they just get it. And I still remember it. like it was yesterday. Still remember the first class I ever taught. These don't go away, these memories. So when I first started teaching, I still remember, those students at Lewisham College who had been failed, like I said, failed in the secondary system, coming in, and then they're passing, and then they're going on to university. And some of them went on to really good universities because of what we did. That takes some beating. When you see those students who've been written off by their schools, written off by a lot of their teachers, suddenly they're going to really good universities and developing careers and just turn, completely different life trajectory. That'll take some beating. With leadership, it's the big and the little things. I still like hearing about colleagues who are publishing their first articles or they're winning research funds. I love hearing, this is why these back to the floor meetings have been great. And I've done about 55 of them in the last year, I think. Because you hear about those little things, the little things that have meaning. And again, if the little things stop having meaning for me, that's probably time to retire as well. And I stop celebrating and being really pleased with people's achievements, because that's what we're there for. We're here for the students, obviously, but I love seeing people's careers develop, even if it means they're leaving here and going to another university for promotion. I always wish them well. And I will tell you a story. So when I got that, I won't say which job because you'll work out who it is. I went for a job, got a promoted job, right? So I was leaving this university, and the VC who had wanted me to take on more responsibility there cut me off, right? Put me on gardening leave the second day just because I was leaving. Cut off my email access, couldn't email all my colleagues to say, I was leaving. It was the worst. And he didn't talk to me. Stopped inviting me to exec meetings. That was it. And I don't know, that's never sat right. And if I ever run into him, I'll have a discussion with him about it. But I don't do that. We celebrate people. What I love about being here, and we talk about this a lot, we're a talent incubator, right? There are people who came here. We want people to build their careers. And that may well mean they're going to other universities, but I love to see it. I love seeing people be successful. People you've helped to develop, people who, and you think back to how green they were when they first started and the experience they've gained and the way you've helped to support them and given them space to experiment and to fail well and learn from that and develop. But people's development, whether it's the students you're teaching or your colleagues, that's still a thrill, and I'm very proud of those things.
Some people would argue education is not a discipline because what we do is education. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, people can say what they like. I don't care. It's a field. Call it a field. Call it a discipline. We know what we're talking about. Education research has long been looked down upon, and I've taken exception with many academics over the years at conferences, quite heatedly sometimes, about that. Who cares? It's the work that's important. I don't care if people call it a field, whether they value it or not. We know it's got value. We know there's very little research that has more value than the work that we do around research. So, I've stopped caring about that stuff. I really have. Let people say, well, they want the work is what's important. It's not how people get carried away with themselves and, their ideas of semantics. It doesn't interest me anymore.
There's a question in the chat, and I think you've addressed some of it already, but I think I'm going to link it to another question that we have that we'd prepared as well. And I think the two are linked in kind of intrinsically. I'm doing what you said. I'm seeing the patterns, Damien. That's what I'm looking at in the qualitative data we have. So the first thing is about early career researchers and things like that. So in this room, we've probably got a fair few PhD students, fair few people who are trying to get on the research ladder and things like that. And actually linked a little bit to Morris's question in the chat, kind of what role do you see them shaping the future, but also how do you create that safe space for people to be novices in this field and things like that? How do you support staff and things like that and feeling novice? I think it kind of wraps those two things up quite nicely, actually.
Yeah, God, mate. If you go back, a lot of things have changed in the university sector. How early career researchers are treated, I don't think has changed much in the last, not since I've been in it. They weren't treated very well back then, and I'm not sure they're treated very well as in the sector now. Some universities do it really well. Some don't. Some see them as just, the precarity of short-term contracts. Being you, we don't have those. People either you're on a permanent contract or you're not. It's as simple as that. We don't do those kind of fractional short-term contracts. I think we got as we're looking at our workforce, we're really expanding the number of GTAs, so graduate teaching assistant. So here it's teaching, but it's research long. So we employ GTAs who will then do a PhD with us. We do fee waivers. We develop them. They have plenty of time for research then. We're not a type of university where we're just seeing how many hours in the classroom you can get out of them and then expect them to do research somewhere else. I mean, you look at the sector now. I mean, there's what were research-intensive universities now giving their academics less research hours than we do. And we're a university that has very little track record of research, but we're building it gradually. And we know to do that, people need time. More than anything, you have to give people time to do research. I know some people, I have met academics who have no interest in research and will use that as an excuse. But for those who are legitimately pursuing research careers, you've got to give them time. So GTA, we make sure we look after them. You have to nurture them. And I'm sorry to say, but in the sector, they need to be protected as well. From organisational practices that are discriminatory, that are even bullying, that are certainly exploitative. So it's a matter of setting a culture where, early career researchers are valued just as much as everyone else in the organisation. They're not cheap labour. Now, I know in some universities they are seen as and used as cheap labour just to do the teaching because there's professors who can't be bothered to teach. And, students are an inconvenience to their research. I've got no time for those people. We've all met lots of them, and we will not tolerate that here. The kind of this is why I'd stop going to a lot of education research conferences because there were a lot of these people, the ones that will speak up, and you get early career researchers, right, doing their first presentation at a conference. They should be nurtured. They should be protected. You'll always get one experienced academic, usually a man, stand up and say, not really a question, more of a comment, and then they give a diatribe. And I've seen it when I was a young man in higher education, and they will take apart that early career researchers' work. Whether it's justified or not, there is no excuse for that behaviour. And actually, I've taken some of them to task. If I see it, I take them to task. And I'll stop it in front of everyone. I don't care. We have to monitor those kind of behaviours because there's too much of it. There's too much bullying that goes on in the sector. There's too much discrimination. There's too much exploitation. And if as senior academics we don't defend people from that, then we're doing our job. I've got on a soapbox then. I do apologise, but it's something, these kind of superstar researchers, I've got no time for them. They don't impress me. You can bring as much money as you want, but if you're treating people badly, this is not the place for you. And I think that more vice-chancellors need to take that position.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We have something called ACRE here at Edge Hill, which is, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's about research and education and based within our education faculty. And there is a specific track for early career and PhD students that is supportive, and you get feedback and you get, supported through delivering your presentation. And the whole idea is you present and it is a supportive environment as opposed to the environment. It's lovely to see that. And I think there's more conferences now, hopefully, doing that, but I'm aware of Puyin's experience as well as presenting as a PhD student. In fact,
because John was there.
I was there.
You know what I'm referring to? Yeah, you were there, weren't you?
Yeah. And I wanted to lamp the person who was asking a question.
Yeah. But again, the culture of universities is one of deference, and I'm not that. I mean, that's why I've upset so many people. I think in my career because I'm not going to be deferent to anyone. If the behaviours, I will judge people on the behaviours. If the behaviours are out of order, I'm going to tell them. And so, you upset a lot of people. But, I'm a white man. I can do things and say things that others can't. So you can't make the most of that, to be honest. And plus, because I look like a bouncer, that always helps as well. So you get away with murder with that. Trust me.
Well. Yeah, I'm not gonna comment on that comment. I'm not gonna get myself into trouble. So I've got a bit of a follow-up question. Because you're the boss of BNU, you could get away with murder probably, metaphorically speaking. What would be your ideal sort of research support culture for, because I consider myself an early career researcher. So this is a question I want to ask as an employee as much as a sector person who has always admired what you do. What would be your ideal setup at BNU or in the sector?
I think, look, time is one thing. Internal funding, seed funding is essential, and we prioritise it for, if you're an experienced academic, you're not going to get internal funding here that we reserve it for early career researchers. I think the culture of getting away from, treating research in its purest form. So you're not doing, I don't want, and it breaks my heart sometimes where you see the kind of cultures that say it's all about the ref. It's just about the ref, just about your income, just about this, just about our journal rankings and all that. And research in its purest form, because it is a good thing to do, because it is a means of developing academics, because it has impact in the sectors we work in. If you're doing education research, there should be an impact on whether it's teaching, leadership, whatever it happens to be. There should be an impact. All of that is far more important than the ref. Pre-university, we've got no expectations. We don't get the sort of income that research-intensive universities do. And I've never worked in one of those and never wanted to. There is a freedom in doing research in a teaching-intensive university, and I like that. You can do the kind of, and if you look at my publications, I've never done half of that. I don't think in a research intensive, because they're saying, well, where's the funding? Where's the impact case study? Who cares? It's a way of developing people. It fed the curriculum. It had an impact in the, in the sector. So just getting back to that purity of research, I think it's hard to balance, because, we do have to enter the ref, etc. But not making research about those kind of metrics, just treating it as though, it is a pursuit of knowledge. I mean, how often does anyone talk about that anymore? If it's just, and I'm not being all romantic and nostalgic unnecessarily, but that is a purpose of the university, pursuing new knowledge. Sometimes that will get ref funding, sometimes it won't. Sometimes it will lead to an impact case study, sometimes it won't. But it's that pursuit of knowledge, And I'm not sounding naive. I know the practicalities that have to go alongside research. There has to be outputs, etc., etc. But if we can protect that as much as possible, that would be the ideal.
That's absolutely music to my ear. But also, like you said, the reality is time, money.
Yeah.
Expected to do more.
And just write. Don't just consider your full-star journals as your only outlet. Have a look at writing for other places. Do some research that's wide enough so you can have a look in other areas or general stuff, rather than your specific, I must get a 4-star in there. Because the practice of writing for alternative outlets is really useful.
And I'd add social media to that as well. When I joined Twitter, I've deleted Twitter for the obvious reasons. When I first started publishing, it was a great way of engaging directly with teachers, saying, here's the research I did. And if you can get that down into that small amount of character, that's good practice. If you can take 100,000 word thesis and get, I love that question about, tell me about your thesis in one sentence. Perfect. That succinctness, it makes it easier to translate. So I completely agree with David. Write for as many different styles, formats, outlets as you can.
So I'm going to piggyback on what you just said, Damien, about, when you said, tell me about your thesis in one sentence. It's a brilliant question. I'm going to turn it on its head and ask you, tell me about your research identity in one sentence.
Yeah, dormant. There you go. One word. See, I exceeded your expectations.
You have indeed. But seriously, if you had to sort of, sum up your research or scholarly practice in a succinct way, what would it be, other than jumping around, following what's interesting? Yeah.
I think I'll go back to making yourself novice again. It's the fundamental in education, the novice into expert, but don't stay an expert. So I think it's putting myself in situations where I'm completely out of my depth and I can only understand about 5% of what's being said or what I'm reading. that for me is perfect. That's how I want to stay.
All right, then. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and thank you for your time as well, Damien.